In this video, I'd like to talk about human rights. One of the things we hear constantly today is me, me, me. I have a right to this. I have a right to that. Give me, give me, give me. But what is a human right and where does it come from? Are there things that we can demand as rights that are universally binding and applicable to all people at all times and in all places? Is there a list of basic human rights that we can truly claim as being owed to us? And does that list develop over time? It seems like people used to refer to basic human rights as food, shelter, and clothing, and now it's women's rights, abortion rights, same-sex rights, transgender rights, all these things that fall under the auspices of human rights. But where do they come from, and who owes them to you? If you're a believer in God, you may believe that God created you, and along with his creation of you, he bestowed upon you certain claims to rights. But I would say that if God created me, then the life he gave me is a privilege. He didn't have to create me. So therefore, food, shelter, and clothing may be things that I need to sustain my life, but they're just extensions of that privilege of life. God doesn't owe them to me. I don't think I can turn around and say, God, you created me, now you owe me certain things that are human rights. Now, if you don't believe in God, and maybe you're an atheist or an agnostic, do you believe that your first ancestor wiggled its way out of the primordial soup, and then over millions of years of time and blind chance, developed into a mammal that walks on its hind legs and developed consciousness, and then turns around and looks at the indifferent, unconscious universe and demands that it bestows you with certain rights? Doesn't seem to make sense to me. Now, if we can get ourselves to a point where we accept the idea that human rights actually exist, then who is required to deliver or provide you with those rights? Remember that if you have a right, someone else has an obligation. So if food and shelter are human rights, who is obligated to give those to you? If you and I were the only two people on earth, and you claim that food and shelter are human rights, do I have to give those to you? Food and shelter would also be my human rights. Are you obligated to give them to me? Because if it's a basic human right, it becomes someone else's obligation to deliver that right to you. So what can you claim as being owed to you by another? Am I obligated to give anything to you? Now, as a compassionate person who cares about neighbor, I may feel compelled to provide food, shelter, and clothing to people that don't have those things, but that's an expression of charity, not an expression of obligation. In fact, if I'm obligated to give you those things, then charity is no longer possible. Now, some might say it's the government's obligation to provide and ensure human rights, but the government is merely an extension of the will of the population. Government is a mechanism that's developed by and comprised of individuals for the delivery of mutual benefits like infrastructure, security, social and economic stability. The mere existence of a government, it doesn't seem to me, would create human rights. I don't believe governments create human rights. We may look to the government and say, you owe me certain things, but they don't create some arbitrary list of items that are owed to you. They just deliver things to you. I don't believe human rights' existence would depend on a delivery mechanism. They either exist or they don't. Now, I would argue that if human rights actually exist, then they would be comprised of things that would apply to both a primitive tribe living in mud huts and to an advanced society with a fully functional, democratically elected government. So if human rights are universal and immutable, then I would suggest a fair litmus test that should be applied to something to determine whether or not it's a right would be, if you and I were the only two people in the world living in primitive circumstances, would I be able to deliver to you the rights that you claim? So in other words, without the benefit of technology, would I, out of my own strength and ability, be able to give to you those things that you claim are rights? Now, if you accept that as a good litmus test for what constitutes a basic human right, then a right can't be anything that requires something beyond myself to deliver that to you. So it can't be dependent on technology or specialized knowledge, because if human rights are universal and binding, then they should be able to be delivered to anyone at any time, in any place, regardless of what technology may or may not exist. These are basic, fundamental rights. They shouldn't depend on some delivery mechanism beyond the power of another individual. So I would argue that access to healthcare, for an example, is not a human right, given that it is dependent on technology and specialized knowledge to deliver that right to you. And again, it may well be something that a compassionate and capable society should provide to its members, but that doesn't mean it's a right. So if a human right is someone else's obligation, and those obligations are not dependent on anything beyond an individual's capability to deliver to another, then I would suggest the list of human rights must be a pretty short list. What can I, in my own power and abilities, deliver to you, another human, as rights? It must be things that I can control. But again, am I obligated to give certain things to you? Do human rights actually exist? And if they do exist, where would we find a list of obligations that are universally binding? They would have to be derived from a source that is authoritative to all people at all times and all places. The only source I can think of would be a higher power, like God. Now, I don't believe we have any claims to rights before God, but perhaps human to human, there are things that we owe to each other. But what are those things? So I would suggest that the only way you can come up with a list of basic human rights is to turn to the Bible. And I would suggest we turn to Exodus chapter 20 and take a look at the 10 Commandments. Now, not all the commandments can be turned into rights, but I believe we can derive rights from a number of these commandments. So, for example, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12 says, "Honor your father and mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you." So perhaps the right of a parent is to be respected by their children. If we're required to respect our parents, that's an obligation on us. Therefore, it's a right on their behalf. Verse 13, "You shall not murder." So if I'm not supposed to murder you, I could derive from that you have a right to life. You have a right to live a life without threat of violence or death from someone else. My obligation is not to murder you. Your right is to have life. Verse 14, "You shall not commit adultery." So if committing adultery is wrong, I could derive from that you have the right to marry and enter into a marriage contract that is binding and not to be destroyed by myself. Verse 15, "You shall not steal." If I am obligated to not steal from you, then I could derive from that you have a right to private property. Now verse 16 says, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." So that can be applied to lying. So you have a right to have the truth told about you, and specifically in a court of law, I'm obligated to not bring false witness against you. I must be truthful. So you could derive from that commandment that you have a right to a fair trial, to not be accused of something that you didn't do. Now what's interesting is that I had to derive those rights from the inverse of these commandments. So in other words, this list doesn't communicate all the things that I can demand from you that are owed to me as rights. It's a list of things that I must do in my treatment of you. And that's the beauty of Scripture. It gets rid of self. This isn't a list of all the things that you are owed. It's a list of all the things that you are obligated to do for your neighbor. And perhaps if we had that mindset in life, we wouldn't go around yelling about what's owed to us as rights. Instead, we'd be more concerned about loving our neighbor and doing for them what is right.